Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm Adam Weinberg, the Alice Pratt Brown Director of the Whitney, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to the 13th Annual Annenberg Lecture, which in the past has presented artists, it's hard to believe it's 13 years, Susan Rothenberg, Lorna Simpson, Jeff Koons, Frank Stella, and last year, Martha Rossler. The Annenberg Lecture traditionally features a distinguished artist who has made a significant contribution to art and culture. It was created in 2003 with Stephen Ames, an esteemed and beloved trustee of the Whitney Museum for many, many years, a dear friend. And Steve Ames passed away last year. It is a testament to his commitment to the Whitney that we are gathered here tonight. I'm just sorry he isn't here tonight because he would have loved this. I'd particularly like to acknowledge Steve's wife, Ann Ames, who is here with us this evening. Thank you, Ann. As well as Liz Kabler, who is tonight, I believe, here as well, representing the Annenberg family. Thank you so much for your great support of the museum. It's my great pleasure to introduce Kathy Opie, and I'm going to make my introduction only a half hour long, so you get to hear her 15 minutes. I think it was 12 pages. I think we have it down to 3 now. But I wanted to give her something to say. So I think, Kathy Opie is an artist whose work, I think, touches on the most essential questions of American identity today. She uses photography to describe the people and places around her, and in the process helps us to see the world differently, and thank God we need to, perceiving things we might have overlooked or taken for granted. Over the last 3 decades, her subjects have included the freeways of Los Angeles, lesbian families, surfers, Tea Party gatherings, teenage football players, Wall Street, and most often, her friends and loved ones. Taken together, Kathy's formal portraits, intimate domestic scenes, and solitary landscapes comprise a portrait of the United States, often bringing to light subjects that challenge the conventional myths about what this country looks like. For Kathy, the personal truly is political. In a 1994 review in the LA Times, she described herself as a kind of twisted social documentary photographer. Have to ask her about that. Her work draws on the rich history of American photography, melding the political engagement of documentary to the rigorous theoretical challenges of conceptual art in large-scale color photographs. She has also expanded photography's place in art history, connecting it to the history of painting and to the traditions of portraiture going back many years. Moving between genres, styles, and formats, the sprawling totality of Kathy's works presents us with a tender and beautiful images of an extraordinary range of individuals and communities. Her subjects manifest our shared humanity without effacing irreducible differences. That's not easy to do. Kathy has a long history with the Whitney. She was in her first Whitney Biennial in 1995 and then again in the 2004 Biennial. The Whitney is so pleased to have considerable holdings of Kathy's work, and her work has appeared in our permanent collection shows starting in the opening in America is Hard to See in 1999, which was our inaugural exhibition downtown headed up by our curator Donna DeSalvo. She is also in the exhibition Human Interest Portraits from the Whitney's collection, which Scott Rothkopf, our chief curator, and team worked on. Kathy's work's been shown throughout the world at museums and galleries, not surprisingly, and she has had so many solo exhibitions. They're too numerous all to mention, but I want to just mention a few. There was the one at MoCA in 1997, her Walker Arts Center one-person show in 2002, and a show that I hope many of you here in New York saw at the Guggenheim Museum, I think it was in 2008, which was an amazing survey show. Each room of that was just absolutely impeccable. It was really an extraordinary and a moving show. Her work has been shown abroad at the Centre Pompidou, at the Reina Sofia, and many, many other places. And she has received many distinguished awards, including the President's Award for Lifetime Achievement from the Women's Caucus for Art and the United States Artist Fellowship. It is my great, great pleasure to introduce Kathy Opie.
After you. Okay, that was a beautiful introduction. Thank you.
The questions. Okay.
Here we are.
Here we are. Hi, everybody. There you are.
I
that's right. We're over here too.
We don't have to
screen.
turn our
That's
head.
great.
It's a whole new thing that we get to look down here as well as out at all of you.
What I love about this picture is it seems to presage so much of your work.
It's the first self-portrait. With my first camera that was given to me on my 9th birthday. And it's my little house in Sandusky, Ohio behind me where I grew up until I was 13. And, it pretty much talks about a lot about who I am still to this day, except for I don't wear flowered pants anymore, and I have learned to zip my zipper up. So
I didn't notice that, by the way.
I know, the zipper's down. Go figure. Precocious even at 9.
And so, when did you get your first camera?
It was 9 because I actually took apart my grandfather's cameras. He had a darkroom in Sandusky, so I would spend a lot of time with him in his darkroom. And one day he came home, and I had decided to use his tool bench and explore his camera, and had taken apart the whole thing and thought that I actually could put it together, and I didn't. And he was both my grandfather and both on both sides, as well as my mom. They really did a lot of images, both in home movies as well as
So you were surrounded by pictures.
I was surrounded by pictures and surrounded by artists. And my dad had this company in Ohio called Opie Craft, and we made basswood boxes and plaques for people to decoupage. And so I grew up in this kind of craft movement, that the company was started in the 20s. And my dad took over the company, so until we moved to California.
Well, I noticed in something I read about your early biography is that you did a book report when you were in maybe elementary school on Lewis Hine.
Yeah, that's why I asked for the camera, because I wanted to be I probably didn't say social documentary photographer at that point in my life, and I certainly didn't say twisted one. But yeah, I wanted to actually make images, and really knew that. And it was, I grew up dyslexic, and so I found that photographs informed me so much more than often words on pages did. And that Lewis Hine photograph just really affected me, because the girl is about the same age as I am in the Carolina Mill. And it was a generation where people were really looking at photographs too. You had Look magazine, you had Life magazine. It was a generation where American culture was being described through, documents.
Through photographs.
Yeah.
And so at what point did you start thinking you were going to be a photographer?
Well, I wanted to all the way through. I built my own darkroom at the age of 14 with babysitting money. And, really wanted to study photography. And first I wanted to make films and do that. And then I realized, I looked at the statistic of women in that field, and I realized I didn't have a chance. And so I said, well, maybe a better chance with photography. And then my dad made me get my real estate license when I was 18, because he said, art school's not going to really work out for you.
Like any good parent.
Yeah, any good parent. It's okay. You can go sell some houses. It'll all be okay.
But you were tracking pretty early on the idea of having a career in art.
Yeah, and my uncle and aunt are both artists, and I was surrounded with the craft company, there was always artists in our family. And it actually was a person here in New York, a painter, Eleanor Schnurr, who I visited for Thanksgiving one year. And she said, you're an artist. I was going to an all-girls school in Virginia at the time, where the main majors were horsemanship and ballet. Yeah. I ended up there with Peterson College guy. Don't ask me how that happened. But I was taking photo classes there, but I was studying to be a kindergarten teacher. And Eleanor looked at me and she goes, little chairs and you, it's not going to work. So she goes, go move to a major city and become an artist. That's who you are.
And then you moved to?
San Francisco.
And we're at the Art Institute?
Yeah, the Art Institute through the 80s.
And was there somebody in particular at the Art Institute that had a real?
Yeah, a number. But I would say Larry Salton and Hank Wessel. like Henry Wessel Jr., but Hank.
And what about them and their work?
I think that Hank really taught me, he gave me an important assignment. It was like I was a sophomore. And at that point, you're really studying out of the Zarkowski School of Photography.
Right.
So, and Hank also was part of that kind of canon of photography. And he made me shoot 5 rolls a day for a year. He said, no matter what, you're going to shoot 5 rolls a day. You're going to go out, you're going to hit the streets, you're just going to do it. You're going to look, and you're going to look, and you're going to look. And then you're going to decide within that there's maybe some photographs that stand up. And so the Art Institute taught me incredible work ethic. And then CalArts tried to basically break that apart and make me smarter. So
you learned how to make photographs before you got there, and then you learned how to think when you got to CalArts?
Yeah, pretty much so. I mean, I think there was some thinking at the Art Institute, too. I mean, I had, Angela Davis was my philosophy teacher. I had an incredible, just incredible writers as well. And it was a think tank to a certain extent, but you really worked there. I mean, it was this kind of, what it is to be a working artist ethic.
And when you got to CalArts, was there somebody who was a particular mentor there, or was it the whole crew?
Well, a number of them. Alan Sekula and I had a very interesting and contentious relationship, but it was ultimately a good one. Catherine Lord beat the shit out of me, but it was also okay.
She beat the shit out of me in graduate school, too, so we have that in common.
So I hung out a lot with Krzysztof Wadishko. So he was teaching. And we would drink vodka all night long together and have these really long, interesting conversations. And it was at the time that he was making the homeless vehicle cart, and I kept arguing with him about it, that it was a really bad idea. And so we had these really long discussions about how he was really going to change the homeless population in New York through this. And I said, I think conceptually it's really important, but I don't think that you're actually going to have New York
in homeless carts.
with homeless carts. So
why don't we jump in? We have lots of pictures for you tonight, and wonderful ones, and so maybe we can go through a few of these, and you can kind of talk a little bit about them.
So with Being and Having, it was actually the first body of work I made out of grad school, and I had an interesting in grad school, I mainly did work on master plan communities in suburbia, and I had all these queer professors who kept constantly saying to me, well, why aren't you making queer work? You should be making queer work. And I'm like, actually, deconstructing master plan communities is queer to a certain extent, to look at it. How do we define what work is and our identity in relationship to work? And I think that is something that I've always grappled with in all these different ways in terms of not being a singular identity. But Being and Having was right after grad school, and all my friends and I would wear these fake mustaches, and we'd go hang out at the only 7-day-a-week lesbian bar in L.A. Called Amelia's. And we would be on our motorcycles in LA. If you're a San Francisco dyke and you move down to Los Angeles, it's a little hard to figure out how to fit in. And so we'd wear our mustaches and we'd be on our motorcycles and we'd try to give women rides home. And it never happened. Nobody really took a ride from us.
Did you pick out your own mustaches?
Oh yeah, and so then I really began to think about this body of work and ideas of masculinity, and also the fact that I've been called sir my whole life. And including, my mother would always be like, no, she's a little girl. And I'd be like, no, I'm not. But I think that I was really interested in kind of the construct of identity at that point in time in relationship to how masculinity was being read. But it also was 1989, 1990, but specifically also how women are portrayed in images. So when you think about the gaze, it's often that the woman is the object looking off in the distance. And so what did it mean to have all these badass women wear fake mustaches and stare out at you in terms of the audience? And then each of them had their own nickname with their little plaque. So it's playing with that history of portraiture to a certain extent, or what is identity? Is identity a brass plaque that goes on a frame that tells you who it is, And when you look and you wander through like the National Portrait Gallery and you see the brass plaque, I just thought it was really funny when their names were like Chief and Pigpen and Luigi and Oh So Bad, and like what did it really
Well, they're kind of like trophies too, with those little
and they're
plaques,
a little bit like trophies,
specimens
but
or
you
something.
can't really have them. They're approachable, but they're not approachable. And then it was the first time that I went into the studio and used studio lighting and picked this really weird yellow background.
And these were done as large format photographs?
This is all shot with a 4x5 camera, yeah. And because I wanted the webbing, and it was so interesting because even after I made them and they would show, I remember they were in a show in Santa Barbara Museum, and this woman walked up to me and she goes, I think I know some of these guys. And I was like, they're all lesbians with fake mustaches. And she was like, totally taken aback, and she had worked at the museum and had been living with the work. So it's again that assumption of what identity does, how to read masculinity, and usually
undermining what you say.
Usually women aren't taking up space and staring back at the camera that way. So.
And also too the way you crop it. I mean, in the top and bottom, and also the kind of graphic quality of it.
Yeah, I would never cut off the top of the head anymore, but it was really kind of about this certain kind of framing. And they're portraits, but they're also not portraits. They're performative in a certain way. And it's interesting because I've never made really this kind of cropping or awkward portrait since I made this body of work. But it did lead me to the next body of work.
Yeah, I mean, they do have, I mean, some of them especially do have a nice light touch to them and a sense of humor. So there's that, that questioning quality. I mean, it's both the humor and the darkness at the same time.
No, and humor is important in work, and this is probably one of the more humorous bodies of work.
How did people react to these when they saw them? I mean, generally,
I think they were
positively received. Or?
Yeah, I think they were, and I think that they were surprised. I think that people were surprised that I made them in a certain way.
And were you surprised in a way?
Oh God, do you really get surprised around your work? No, I wasn't necessarily. They came out the way that I wanted them to come out. But I was surprised that all of a sudden people were showing my work, or wanted to show them, because I hadn't really had that happen before.
No, because one of the things that you can keep going to the next, but the way you shift from different types of bodies of work, I often feel like you're trying to kind of surprise yourself in different ways, and we can.
I would say challenge myself.
Okay.
I think it's really important for artists to challenge themselves. And also, it's often, I always tell the students that I work with that the most important thing for me in terms of being an artist is trying to answer questions that with bodies of work that you're trying to make, that you have a certain set of questions that you're exploring, and whether or not a body of work can actually do that is really interesting to me.
And do the questions come out of making the work, or do you have some of the questions in your head before you start?
Usually before. And then I have all these rules. And then it's about whether or not I break my own rules because I've found a different question when I'm making the work. And I think that's another interesting thing for artists. It's like, well, how do you break a rule? Like when I was making mini malls, which you might have some in, I don't know if you do. Like I remember wanting every single.
I wanted to surprise you.
I know. I don't know what images are in here, by the way, you guys. This is Angela, by the way, and this was done in '92. But when I was making the mini malls, like one of the rules was there couldn't be any cars in the parking lot. So I would just go out every Sunday morning, and there'd be that one car in that one mini mall that I would want to photograph, and then it would be like, okay, just let that car be there. It's just hard. But the portraits started really after being in Having, and I really felt an urgency to begin making portraits of my own community in a very humble way, or as humble as I could. And so I was using Holbein as kind of a place of beginning to think about the formality of portraiture as well as color, and as well as the gaze. And Holbein has always been really important to me in terms of the details.
Well, it's interesting also, too, and I mean, I think we have an image of Holbein. You can jump ahead here,
for
example. But it's interesting, you often, in reading things that you've said and hearing you talk, you often actually make references as much, if not more so, to painting than you do to photography itself. And yet you're really conversant with the history of photography.
Yeah. No, I think that that's all of us have our internal struggles, and I would say that I probably came to painting in terms of a relationship of the narrative, exploring museums at a young age with my father and my uncle being he's a plein air painter. And I realized that the stories in painting for me and the way that people were depicted were much more interesting than photographs, because my struggle with photography has always been the relationship of the practice to documentary. And so for instance, like these are made in, the early 90s. What would have been common for a photographer to do at that point in time would be going into people's homes and photographing them in their surroundings as in terms of documents and how documentary photography was positioned. So it's also trying to reposition the language in a certain way that it can work on multiple platforms in terms of also getting the audience to engage with the work. And so a lot of even though I really love photography and I know photography extremely well, a lot of times I wouldn't completely engage with it on a multiple kind of intellectual level of what the image really was doing here. And so in taking Holbein and making this body of work, it began to, it was the beginnings of me trying to realign myself with my own practice, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, because, and I don't want to talk a lot of technique tonight, but you do often work in a large format camera, which is slow going.
Yeah.
And it is very detailed, both in process, but in also what it results, which is like
detail. And detail is always, like, I want to read every bit of skin. And especially with this, my community in terms of the leather community, like skin and texture and tattoos and piercing and all of that is really important to kind of, that the body is as much of a site of architecture as looking at architecture, which I have also done in my practice. So I really view the body in that way as well.
It's exquisite.
This is a crystal mason.
And you used the blank backgrounds to isolate them so that you would really focus on the textures of the skin and of the body and of the clothing and all of that?
Yeah, and it allowed the subject to pop in a different way. And again, just using color. If you're going to use color, then let color kind of like take over in a certain way. And I really appreciate what color can do. And I think that painters are more apt to really lay down color than photographers are. Photographers kind of look, it's always about the light and whether or not the light is doing what you need it to do for this. But in terms of these, it's like they do hearken back to really beginning to think about painting. And then in a certain way, do people then think about the queer community in a different way, because they're also acknowledging a certain history that's being applied to kind of current...
Right, a current setting, so they see it as part of a longer chronological sweep and not just that it's of a particular moment.
Yeah, because one of the biggest questions with me always is like, how do you hold a person, not in terms of physically, but hold a person's attention in relationship to wanting to engage with an image over and over and over again, that it's not just a one take and a pass on, but that you can actually sit with something and hopefully see different things over a long period of time with an image, or you come back to an image. And that's what I've always loved about photography, is its actual position in terms of what it can do historically. Like, this work was radical in the early 90s, but I would say that it's really not really that radical anymore. And it's...
Radical in what sense? In terms of the subject matter, the approach to
subject, I would say subject and approach a little bit, but I would say subject for sure. I mean, in the middle of making this, I was losing all of these friends in terms of AIDS, and I was part of ACT UP and Queer Nation, and what it meant for, like, my friend Stake to tattoo Dyke on the back of her neck in 1992 was an incredibly brave act in my mind. And so, you know, painting has its own history, but then photography is of the moment, and it is a record.
Yeah. And it's funny because, I mean, these works in a way are at the intersection of that. They have a kind of durational quality that's a little different than what one thinks of as photography in a way. And maybe it is that act of concentration and, you know, working with such levels of detail and also relating it so much to the history of painting. I mean, here you have this kind of brocaded silk background.
Yeah, I know, the fabric backgrounds. I really, really love it when I go to the Getty and I see the fabric walls and paintings hung on fabric walls. And I just, you know, said, well, why not just go all the way in? Yeah, self-portrait cutting.
Yeah.
So
I mean, these were in the 95 biennial, right? Wasn't it? Or was
Pervert was.
Oh, Pervert was.
Pervert
which is
was,
coming. Oh, there it
which
is.
was so intense. I can't
Yeah,
even
I
tell
remember.
you. For me, because it was the first time that I was ever in a major museum exhibition. I had to go home to my parents and tell them I made this
picture was in it?
photograph. I had to go home and say, you guys, this is going to hang in the Whitney Museum in New York, and I kind of need you to know before it's possibly talked about in public. And it was really...
And their response?
Well, my dad loved it because my dad was really a strange man. My mom had a really hard time with it, a really tough time with it. My sister-in-law told me that I was no longer allowed to have access to my niece. But that didn't work out for her at all because I'm basically Kayla's parent. But it was interesting for me because I had to also, I was making this work within the realm of my own community. Right. And so it was another coming out.
And it was also in the
context of
context
it was a really
of
personal coming out.
Too,
it was like, whoa, it's like I'm there and I did this and I made this piece and it was important to make the piece.
Were you shocked by it yourself?
Well, I can't live with it. And so it's interesting, like also what art is, what you choose to live with. And I ended up, basically after the Guggenheim show, I released the last AP of this for them. And knew that I didn't want to have it, that I didn't need it, that I made it, and it was really important for me to make it, but it wasn't something that I needed to hang on to. It was something that was just meant to be out there in the world. But what happened with it, too, was this assumption that people had about me as a person because of making this piece. And that's what shocked me. It wasn't actually making the piece and doing this because, like,
That's what people assume.
It was the assumptions of my personality. Like, people thought that I would, be scary. Like, I remember, I won't name names, but a really prominent collector who had collected a vast amount of my work. I, as a gift, said, I'll do portraits of your children for you. And they literally said, no, you're not going to. What are you going to do? What are you going to do to my children? And I'd be like, I wouldn't do anything to your children. What are you talking about? But it was those kinds of assumptions that were really shocking for me because obviously there's internal homophobia in every queer. You have to grapple with it, especially my generation of queer. But then in terms of the public presence, it's a whole other...
But this was also, I mean, as well as a personal statement, it was also a political statement.
Very much so.
Because this was right at the...
Look, I'm sitting just like that. See, I still sit like this.
And it was in the... I am too. But it was also at the height of the Jesse Helms and culture wars when this was being made, too.
Yeah, right after that. I mean, Robert had already passed away. I had never met Robert. Obviously, our work parallels in very interesting ways. But it was at a point in time actually within my own community is why I made this piece. It had obviously a lot to do with the conservative right, which maybe I need to make another piece like this now. But it had to do with literally, I was in the March on Washington for gay and lesbian rights, and the leather community became the other within my own community. Yeah. Like, we have family values, all of this other thing, and there was this kind of heteronormative aspect that was happening within a certain aspect of the queer community. And that's why I made this piece. It's like, you guys are calling me a pervert now? Okay, I'm carving this on my chest. And I'm going to be this forever for you, and don this leather hood and do all of that.
Can you go back one image, Megan, if you could? Just because, I mean, this is a piece we have in the Whitney. And I have to say, I mean, and also, I mean, I remember the first time I saw it, pretty tough, not as tough as Pervert, but
yeah, Pervert's tougher.
But you know, it was interesting. David Pagel said at the time that you smuggle into your images of transgressive misfits a sense of wholesomeness, and it's funny. I've come to see this as a very actually tender photograph.
Yeah.
I mean, even though I found it shocking, I mean, in one level.
No, I think it's tender and it's hopeful, and I do have a bowl of fruit over my head. I mean, you know. It is about the replacement of what children draw that represents family, and I always wanted a family, and I made this after my only domestic relationship before my partner Julie now. I made this after that broke up. And I was really struggling with whether or not I was ever going to be able to achieve certain things that I really wanted for myself personally, which was a family and a house and some kind of stability, and whether or not as a dyke that was okay for me to have that as a dream. And
I mean,
written on the body.
Yeah.
And then this is after Oliver, right before Oliver's first birthday. So this is self-portrait nursing, and you can still see Pervert as a scar on my chest, and obviously playing with art history, it's something that I've done with numerous works, but it's definitely the Madonna and Child, but it's
go to the next one.
It's
See,
or the Migrant Mother.
There you go.
Exactly.
Trying to surprise.
Exactly. That's a good surprise. I like that. Yeah. Another
which
iconic.
Which was radical in its day. As radical as yours is.
It was absolutely radical. Dorothea Lange just did hands better than anybody else. Hands are so important in her images. I remember SF MoMA did this amazing installation of her work one time where it was really focusing on just what the hands were always doing within her work. She was, really used that.
I mean, in terms of just, quickly, because, I mean, keep moving, there's so much to cover, but in terms of dealing with self-portrait versus portraiture, I mean, you kind of, it seems like you kind of do self-portraits, then you sort of pull back and then go into other things, and then, but you do keep coming back to self-portraits in various ways.
I think there's very few. I mean, it's so interesting now because the selfie is a whole other thing, right? I did a class at UCLA called Selfie/Self-Portraiture #WhatTheFuck. And
I would have signed up for that class in a heartbeat.
And one of the things is like in this generation where we all carry a camera now, our relationship to self-portraiture is really an interesting thing. But for me, I've always used self-portraiture or these moments of different markers of time in my life, or as kind of being outspoken politically. So that's how it's occurred. But I think that most photographers in the history of photography, I mean, there's a great collection of self-portraits.
Well, also, too, I think in many ways, all of your work is self-portraiture, in a sense. I mean, which I guess is true with any artist. But I think even the diaristic qualities and things.
Yeah.
So these freeways.
So after I made Pervert, and
I remember seeing these and thinking, is this the same Catherine Opie who made the photographs? I kept thinking, no. There must be the label. I remember I saw it in the gallery. I don't remember.
Everybody thought
I kept thinking it was the wrong label for the artist, which I thought was great.
Everybody went there on that one, and I liked it. I liked that everybody was all of a sudden, and I flipped it back to landscape, and also what is iconic. And I think that with the portraits, it is important what I said earlier in terms of that the body is also a site of architecture that we build upon, and the built environment. And I was working 5 days a week as a lab tech at UC Irvine, so I drove from LA, and it took 5 freeways to get to work, and so this was my landscape, and I just kept thinking about how to kind of look at the ideas around 19th century photography and platinum prints, and also look at what was monumental in terms of a specificity of identity of Los Angeles. And even, so it always is in that realm of the specificity of identity for me within the various bodies of work. But just wanting to kind of make these forms in this way to interact with the Los Angeles landscape in a different way.
But even in the, I really noticed, because you play with the notion of format a lot, and even just when you look at the the portraits that are cropped at the top, and then you have the portraits that are vertical. Now you're going out panoramically.
Yeah.
You later go on to and playing with that sense of the structure and how the inside and the outside, and where it then becomes much more of a physical object. It's not that every photograph is an 8x10 photograph, and it's just you're looking into the picture. It is about objectifying the image.
Yeah, and I would say that the way my work is imbued within the history of painting, the materiality of photography is I'm utterly invested in that throughout the work. So probably the most photographic aspect to my work is my love of the materiality of photography, as well as cameras and the kind of technical aptitude I have with the equipment.
And were you trying to also... You're opening up, but at the same time, you're sort of emptying out. There are no cars in any of these pictures.
There's no cars. I mean, some of them are blurred because I stood on Sunday morning and tried to get freeways empty, and it's really hard to empty out freeways because they're not digitized. But the format also is the American West. So it's really thinking about kind of even in terms of Carlton Watkins and. And then this is a 6 centimeter by 17 centimeter camera that was made by Fuji, a really unbelievable camera that took 120 film. And then I ended up having all the American cities is done with a 7 by 17 inch banquet camera. So the negative is actually 717. And that's a very Western format, but it was also a portrait format because a banquet camera was for large banquets. And so it's so
you were actually inverting its use in a way.
Exactly, inverting it a bit for a landscape.
Were you thinking of photographers, kind of new topographic photographers at the time, like Joe Deal and Robert Adams and Baltz and everything?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that all my graduate work on master plan communities was completely informed by new topographics to a certain extent, but also I changed it up too.
Well, one of the things I love about your work is that it's like you go into a body, you go one way, and then you go, oh, I'm this kind of photographer. Now I'm going to be this kind of photographer over here, and not this feeling that you have to have a signature approach to it, and that sense of challenging yourself each time.
Yeah, I get bored really easily.
Yeah, see, and here we are the next. I mean, and if I were to see these side by side,
you wouldn't think it was the same artist.
Exactly.
No, I know, but the key to it, if you see them side by side, is the kind of formal rigor that I have in my work. So I would say that you could look at all the freeways and know that I made this too if you really followed the kind of formality that I bring to various bodies of work. Domestic was made at a time period where I thought that I was going to move in with and have my dream of the cutting on my back, but that didn't really work out. But that's okay. But I was in an RV and I traveled for 3 months around America. And in the same way that high school football is an American landscape in relationship to identity. Domestic is the American landscape in terms of lesbian households. And so it was also very much a conversation with Peter Galassi's show at MoMA.
Terrors and Pleasures.
Yeah, domestic terror, yeah. And, you know, the queer identity was pretty much out of that. And then another really important work that was being done at this time period was Tina Barney. And so in the same way that I would have a conversation with Holbein, I also really like having a conversation with kind of larger aspects of what's happening within the medium.
Yeah, I mean,
And so
Eggleston, this one, I mean...
exactly. Eggleston, you could even see Shore to a certain extent, you know, so using 8x10 camera was basically what Crutzen was doing at this time, Tina Barney, Jeff Wall. So you have all of these, you know, large format users in relationship to describing ideas of everyday life. But this is, you know, basically I would show up in a small town. This is Tulsa, Oklahoma.
And how did you meet the people?
I'd go to a gay bar or friends of friends. I would find somebody's house of a friend that they knew that I could plug in my RV to their wall socket, because I really didn't like staying in the RV parks. They were really weird. Traveling around in RV is great, but the RV parks, it was difficult for me to do that. And I would just go to the bar and have the DJ announce that I was in town for a week and that I was looking for people to do portraits of, and then people would come up and introduce, and you know, I had all my film with me and my dog with me, and yeah. I
mean,
this is actually, see, lesbians are friendly, right? That's a good thing about lesbians. So they actually just broke up, and this is their breakup garage sale. So incredibly,
which are the ones who broke up? You know?
They're tying the apron around, so the two in the middle.
And this was a large format photograph?
It's all 8x10.
See, it's so interesting because, you know, again, the amount of work it takes to make a great 8x10 photograph, it's hard. I mean, it's time consuming, it's slow, and yet the informality of your subjects, and particularly something like this, which looks like it could have been just a snapshot on an iPhone.
Yeah, well, that's what was popular with these photographers in terms of 8x10, is they were supposed to look like snapshots, but then they had all the detail.
Right. There's that tension between the kind of crispness and everything and the level of detail, at the same time the spontaneity.
Yeah, I think the best 8x10 portrait photographer is Sally Mann, though. How she was able to do those images with an 810 blow my mind, because I know how hard it is of a camera to work with.
Well, how do you get subjects? Well, you know, I mean,
how do I direct?
Yes, exactly. I mean, do you just sit there and wait? Do you talk to them?
I talk, but I'm quiet.
Do you not let them know actually when you're taking the picture? I mean, how do you? I mean,
I wait and I watch, and then I, like with an 810 camera, I would pull the dark slide, and then I would just be talking to them and watching, and I'll just be like, just freeze. Because some of these had to be fairly, like this one has an additional light of strobes, but a lot of them were natural lights, so you had to hold still, because an 8x10 camera doesn't have a whole lot of, you know, if you want any depth of field at all. Sorry, I'm talking technical now.
But is it a physical feeling that you know when to do
this?
I mean, because as we know, I mean, the whole history of photography is about when you push the button, you know, and that whole idea of decisive moment, indecisive moment, the waiting, but how do you know when that moment is?
It's a feeling.
It is a feeling.
It's just a feeling that you have what you need, and I think that in a certain way, switching to digital has mucked up my practice a little bit more, because you overshoot. And at this point in time, you know, all I can afford is 10 sheets of film for each household. Right. And so you've got to get that photograph, and, you know, you only have 10 tries, and you can't look at what you've done. So you light the whole thing, and, you know, I couldn't afford 8x10 Polaroid. There was no way. I could barely afford the film going around. So the spontaneity was interesting, because you get these 10 sheets and you just hope that something is there. And then it comes down to editing, where now digital, I often take too many in a portrait setting than I would normally do because people have come to my studio and they like have spent a lot of time, you know, taking care of what they wear, and it's an exchange and it's an experience. Like portraiture is a complete exchange, and you don't want to disappoint them by saying after 10 shots, oh, it's okay now, we're done, because then it was a really fast experience. So I often take more than I need now because I feel like that's what's expected in a studio when people come to sit for you.
Right. You don't want to disappoint.
Right. Yeah, I feel like it's a little bit of the portraits I've been making for the last few years, even though they're very quiet and still and internal and do these other things that I would say these portraits aren't are a different feeling in a certain way. These are in the realm of American kind of documentary photography.
No, and I love to. I mean, if you
This
just
is
go back
a lesbian washer and dryer, by the way. If any of you didn't know what a lesbian washer and dryer looked like.
That's a lesbian washer and dryer.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm happy to know.
Yeah.
No, but I love also what you do with the objects, and I assume that you're not setting these up for the most part in terms of the objects, but...
No, not really. I mean, there's things that then you go in and you wish you could tweak. I really like clocks and pictures and watches.
No, I love that. I love the clock and I love the light bulb.
I love that photography is about time, and that when the clock or a watch is in the photograph, I really like those kind of things of knowing what time it was.
Let's see the wash and dryer again.
Yeah. So when I lectured, after I made this, I'm lecturing around the country, and I was in the South, and it's my sense of humor. I just say that this is a lesbian washer and dryer, and so the Q&A happened, and then a woman raised her hand, and she goes, "Excuse me, but what is a lesbian washer dryer?"
Excuse me, what is a lesbian washer dryer?
And I'm like, that's exactly the point, that it's the same washer and dryer as yours. So get over being homophobic, because we have the same washer and dryers, okay?
Terrific. Okay.
So Wall Street, you put Wall Street in there.
I had to put some New York in here.
This is my blink of living in New York. I call it a blink because it was such a short period of time. I moved from LA and I took a job at Yale, which I couldn't believe that they actually hired me. It was shocking. It was really, and it was fabulous. And I had been making American Cities, and American Cities is a body of work that is all based within this like 7x17 kind of banquet camera, and it's about specificity of identity of American cities, but also in relationship to kind of boom and bust in capitalism and dreams and hopes. So St. Louis was all based around the 1904 World's Fair. Chicago was how they light the architecture at night. LA was mini malls. And so being in New York, I had to do Wall Street. And it was literally, I worked on it for about a year, and it was the few weeks that I finished it, 9/11 happened. And then that landscape completely changed in terms of the landscape I had been looking at.
And you also went out early in the morning the way you did
Sunday.
on Sunday morning.
Sunday mornings.
And this was a rule that you sort of made for yourself too a little bit in terms of...
And it was really fantastic actually photographing New York with this camera, because it was like using a sensibility of Western landscape to the verticality of New York. And we often only think about New York in relationship to its verticality and how it's been photographed. And, I mean, Abbott, of course, I'm thinking about Abbott in this. There's one specific photograph that I feel like basically is almost as if Bernice Abbott took it in the body of work. But yeah, she has
And the shifting,
people.
it's interesting because the landscapes, you seem to shift to black and white or cityscapes.
Yeah.
And then you go back to color. Is there something in particular about the graphicness of the black and white? Is it because of the tradition of photography itself?
Tradition of photography, but also democracy. I think that that's a key kind of component through all the various bodies of work, is my very inherent interest in ideas of democracy, and not only politically, but in relationship to how images are constructed. And so as soon as you have something red in this, your eye is going to go to that. So by photographing black and white, there begins
All
to be
equal.
an equality to the way that you inherently begin to digest the landscape.
And then why wouldn't you do that then in your portraiture and other things? I mean,
Because the black and white, even though I did Girlfriends later on and showed the black and white square of, this is literally probably 2 weeks before the trade towers went down. And it's so interesting because I actually have the other side where I flipped around. There was a fire engine and a building was on fire behind me. And I was photographing all the firefighters, and most of that crew was all lost. And that's the other thing that, for me, is where photography
Marks
is
time.
photography in terms of how it marks time. That you could make a painting of this, and it wouldn't be the same as what happened with the morning light gleaming off that edge of the building that no longer exists. And, and it's just ironic that the light was so bright that the buildings end up looking like ghosts to a certain extent. Photography does that, but you also never think of photography in terms of being instantaneous and as a history. Like photography is about going back to the migrant mother and going like, the Depression, yes, that's the iconic image.
well, at one point you said something about the idea of thinking about what is iconic and re-imaging what that notion is of iconic and trying to rethink what icons are.
Yeah, I think
do you feel that's a lot, like, especially when you're photographing subjects that have like a lot of historical connections, that you really want to try to reinvent that?
Yeah, debunk it to a certain extent, like going in the container ship from Korea to the port of Long Beach and doing every sunrise and every sunset, which is the absolute most cliche thing that you could possibly think about photographing, but by keeping the horizon line in the middle, which is also this kind of Helen Molesworth said this really beautiful thing in an essay about that's my line of democracy in the middle.
Talk about lines and in the middle.
Yeah, the surfers. The ice houses happened first as a landscape for me. And then when I left New York and went back to teach at UCLA and left Yale, I realized that I wanted to make the surfers in relationship to the ice house photographs. And it's about it's also about the idea of format in photography, that we often think of a landscape as either like panoramically, like I was doing with the American cities, or we think of a landscape really in terms of its horizontal status within photography. So the verticality of this, with the horizon line being the kind of matching point, also begins to metaphorically talk about the kind of fractured landscape, so to speak, and kind of a fractured relationship to society and community and what it means to wait and hover, and it kind of encapsulates all of these other things that I begin to think about.
It's one of the things I'm struck by is that, as a photographer, you're waiting for the moment, and here are the surfers waiting for the moment, and in fact, nothing is really happening, and you've captured a moment that isn't happening but waiting to happen. Because these are the most undramatic surfing pictures. I mean, they're nothing like your Hawaii 5-0
well, that's
image.
the debunking of the iconic too, is that in sports photographs, like in high school football, it's all about the action versus the landscape. And so this is a way of making landscape as well as I'm really in love with ideas around American genre painting. Like figure and landscape it's a huge place I go to.
Well, some of these become extremely abstract, and it's almost, especially if you stand back, you don't even know that they're really figures, and it's almost like a...
Well, there's one, like the ice houses, there's a white-on-white moment that you don't even see in ice house.
And is this where you're playing with abstraction and painting, too? Very much
it's
so.
my Ryman moment.
Yeah, that's what I... Without rhyme or reason. Anyway, moving right on. Had to do it, sorry. So now we're
Now we're back to like.
See, I love this. It's like, again, it's like these shifts. It's like pulling back, shifting, turning.
Yeah, In and Around Home was a body of work that followed another body of work called 1999, where my friend Daphne and I did a road trip across right before 2000 came around. And remember that quaint fear before 9/11, the quaint fear of Y2K, right? We're going to lose all our information. So we did this meandering road trip all on back roads, and the only rule was that anytime one of us saw something that we wanted to photograph, that we would stop the car. And I think it was about 3 weeks. We broke down at one point. We bought BB guns at the Kmart in New Mexico because we didn't know what to do. But that body of work as an American landscape kind of hung out all by itself. And then when I moved back to LA, and and it was during the election of Bush, and all of this stuff was going down, I realized that since 9/11, this kind of quaint fear has turned into a different fear, of an internal fear of being at home. Right. Nobody's doing long road trips anymore. Like, there's a different kind of urgency. So I made In and Around Home as a discourse. So that's Monica Lewinsky in a blue dress, the last one.
See, it's interesting
so
just
it's
actually to see them
mural.
together, because what I find interesting is how you're constructing a story here, and they're going in and out, and it's the personal, it's the political, and I mean, as opposed to a series of surfers or a series of urban landscapes, you're telling different aspects of the story from different perspectives.
And then I did Polaroids off the TV, because it's another thing in terms of, digital photography and the kind of changing of information, but also the constant stream of the news. So I'll come out another way here. I have watched Days of Our Lives since I was 7 years old. So the character Philip is going off to war on the soap opera, and then we have Bush thumbs up, and then it's late night TV, and it's Judge Dykes, and you just have to take a picture of a judge named Dykes. And so the Polaroid being the instantaneous material that obviously also was going to become, now they're bringing it back, but.
Right.
So with this news cycle, what is like the materiality of photography being instantaneous was more interesting to me to format images off the TV than it would have been to just photograph the television.
And these Polaroid images were all part of the same series, too.
Yeah, In and Around Home.
You didn't really separate between the large format, the Polaroids. It was really mixing the media in that way.
And then there's the blonde news reporter and the brunette news reporter.
Yeah, I love this.
And this was out, and then Abandoned TV. So all of these have titles. Often I have a really hard time titling work, but these all needed titles. And then Julie, my partner, with her dog Myra. And that was like 2 days before my dog of 16 years I had to say goodbye to. So I needed a self-portrait. Or it was actually Julie took the picture.
So how do you tie, the picture, say, of you and Julie and back to the political with the Bush, and then with George Bush?
Well, it's a queer household under a Bush administration. Two women raising a family together in South Central, near USC, and the kind of climate of that neighborhood in relationship to a very wealthy university at a time of just huge upheaval, in my opinion, which is now, I can't believe now all of a sudden we think Bush is okay. It's like, how did that happen? So then, then they started actually making me think about the political landscapes, which is an ongoing body of work of Tea Party and so forth. So going to the USC tailgate and doing these frontal crowd. So I'm going back to kind of my San Francisco Art Institute days of being a street photographer. And I really like combining the idea of the home with the street in relationship to talking in broader terms of what was happening politically at this time period in our country. And then this is the Martin Luther King Parade. Such a different scene than just USC versus, the neighborhood. It was
But it's interesting.
amazing.
Your point of view does not feel judgmental. It's interesting between the different communities that you go through, and also in the later ones where you see clearly the left and the right. I feel like you suspend that kind of a judgmental quality. I mean, and I'm referring a little bit more later to the next.
Oliver
series,
in a tutu.
I love that.
Yeah. And then that flag hung in front of our house for 8 years. So we, the people, say no to the Bush agenda with the Christmas tree, which is like, you know, kind of in dark shadow of dark times. So, these two are funny because they actually follow in the series in terms of the sequence of the book. So this is titled Debate. And then the next one is the title is Talking to the Bush. So if you go to the next image. So this is Talking to the Bush.
And are they intended as
So they're intended as conversation pieces.
So are these pieces, though, in a sequence? I mean,
in a book.
In the book
and
they are.
I would sequence them in this way in terms of an installation, too. I would probably mirror the sequence of the book to an installation.
So is sequencing really important to you then?
Completely. Always. I always install all my exhibitions. It's very hard for me to allow curators to... I
remember that.
No, it's really interesting. But now I think I'm ready to let go. Like I'm wanting to let go a little bit more, actually. I feel that I've controlled so much around my work in areas because I think that until the Guggenheim show, I think a lot of people were like, what is she doing? Like, she does all this stuff. I don't understand her as an artist. And that really helped format the work and the ideas of the threads through the bodies of work. But yeah, I sequence everything. And books are classic, right? I mean, photography books are these...
like The Americans or Walker Evans or Meyer White. Exactly.
And then this is an LAPD helicopter. And then it ends, the body of work ends on optimism, which is the rainbow kite. So you go from surveillance to optimism.
I think we have a couple more, but I'm having so much fun. I feel like we've only had 5 minutes and I'm just warming up. But
So high school football started because I had to be in Louisiana. I didn't have to be. I chose to be. But my wife's family is from Louisiana, and we spend time there. And she's from a very large Catholic family. She's the middle of 8. And I was going down for 10 days in August. And I was just like, oh, wow, Julie, what am I going to do for 10 days? And, and then I started asking my nephews if I could go to their high school football practices. And then this is the first kind of landscape in Louisiana that I made. This is my nephew's team. And then I realized that there was this way to enter American culture that was also very much aligned with in my mind, the fragility of these young men who are not thought of fragile at all because they're, the people that us queers feared in high school.
Right.
But the number of these young men who go off into the military.
Right.
I felt that in the same way that I was bearing witness, and then with this body of work, I do talk a lot about bearing witness and what that means as a photographer. And
do you also see these as an extension of your whole thinking about gender and the construction of gender as well?
No, not that much. It's interesting. I've had those questions because a lot of people assumed that I was having a conversation with Collier Shore's wrestlers in making high school football. And I said, no, there's actually a difference because I think that in Collier's work, she was identifying with that masculinity in terms of wanting to be part of that masculinity.
And you didn't.
And I didn't want to be, I've never wanted to be a high school football player. And, but what I saw was the kind of tenderness of these young men and vulnerability. And I'm raising a young man in this world, I mean, I have a boy, I have a son, and all these nephews that I have. I mean, we have 28 nieces and nephews in Louisiana, and now there's even more little ones. And I think that I was really aware of my own kind of construct of masculinity and my own preconceptions around identity, that I kind of even wanted to explore that and begin to allow a different conversation to come about of these young men.
These are very tender.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it was Jeff Winningham who did a series of football photographs back in the 70s, and it's quite the opposite of this. I mean,
This is my old high school, Poway High. And this is in 29 Palms. And so the other thing about the body of work is it traverses all through America. So from Alaska to Hawaii to Maine to Ohio, Texas. So it is about the way that we look at the site of American landscape through high school football. And 29 Palms was fascinating and slightly heartbreaking because that's a huge military base. And over half of the kids on this team, both parents were deployed to Iraq.
Yeah.
And so, and then after I made this body of work, everybody who sat for me, and this is always a rule with me, they all get a portrait. So I sent the portraits back to the coach, and they got it. And then, you know, since this body of work, I've received 2 letters from parents saying how valuable this photograph is because their son was killed in Afghanistan or Iraq.
You know what I'm going to do? What I'm going to do is I'm going to we'll go through silently through about 8, and then I want to end, though, because you're working on a film, and I'd love to end it, and I'd love for you to just talk a few minutes about the film. So let's just we can just go through them. You can just enjoy the pictures. Yes. These are the political landscapes.
The first inauguration.
The agony and the ecstasy.
The 100th anniversary of the Boy Scout Jamboree. And then Women's March. And then this is what I've been working on for the last 5 years, is these very formal portraits of predominantly artists as well as abstract landscapes of national parks.
And I love the way you sequence these very abstract images with these very precise images. Not that actually the abstract ones are any less precise, but that amazing portrait of Lawrence Weiner, it's extraordinary.
Oh, that's a new one.
Thelma
and Duro, in London.
Was that Niagara Falls?
Yeah, but they're all untitled. But that's the thing, is like in the days of our cell phones now, we go to the Grand Canyon and we take a picture and we've experienced the Grand Canyon, and everybody looks at it on Instagram and your feed and Facebook, and what have you really experienced? So so the abstract landscapes are to displace you, but they're also all places that are known and iconic. And it's, how do we deal with landscape photography today? It's a big question for me.
So if you could just say a few words about the modernist, because this is your most recent project, and then if we still have time to do 5 minutes of questions, I don't know.
The Modernist is a film in conversation with Chris Marker's La Jetée, which was made in 1963. And La Jetée is, I think, a film that not only every filmmaker who's experimental loves, but also every photographer, because it's comprised of just photographs. And so the Modernist is based on my friend Pigpen, who I've photographed for the last 30 years. And he's an artist who starts basically making these collages out of modernist houses in the studio, putting LA Times articles over them, so cutting out the newspaper. And so the film is silent except for one moment. So La Jetée had the moment of the blink. I have one moment of sound in the middle of it, and that's my nod to Chris Marker's Blink. But it's over 800 images, and it is 22 minutes. And it's basically this character, Pigpen, who is really dealing with the current time that we're all dealing with right now. So he lives in one tiny room. That's his studio. He sleeps on the couch. Modernism was the utopic dream for us, right? It was going to provide us affordable housing. It was going to, you know, it was designed perfectly for, you know, being a kind of a sign of utopia to a certain extent. So much so post-World War II in relationship to Los Angeles and who came to Los Angeles as far as Neutra and Schindler and so forth.
Sort of the opposite of Chris Marker, because that's sort of a post-apocalyptic.
Right. So with him, it's post-apocalyptic. Exactly. It's the fear of nuclear war.
Right.
And about regaining memory. But right now, we've been thrust into this weird moment of nostalgia. Make America great again. Like, what does that really mean for all of us? And what does it mean, especially in relationship to being an artist who's trying to create, who could never begin to even afford a home except for one room?
And what does it mean for you right now?
You know, I think that most of us are pretty freaked out. And I think that I've always made work about our times. And this was a way for me to be very, very poetic and make a piece that I've always wanted to make in relationship to conversation with La Jetée. But also, obviously, in the same way that my work isn't about fixing anything or changing anything, it's purely about creating moments of thoughts in relationship to how we function as a society and what is humanity and all of those bigger questions that so many of us are actually grappling with.
And does it have a special urgency for you now?
Yeah, it does. And so what happens with this character is he starts burning down the most iconic modernist houses of Los Angeles. So he destroys what he can obtain, you know, because often we destroy what we love the most. And there's also all the LA Times that he cuts up are fabricated between real news and fake news. So you'll see that Democrats make Hillary Clinton a historic nominee, which is real, but next to it, you see that the first house that the character has burned down is Larry Gagosian's house in Los Angeles. And so it, you know, this is even before the election, obviously, so it was before we even knew that Trump would be president. But I just felt this urgency in relationship to positioning nostalgia, that modernism was a really great vehicle to try to expand this conversation and dialogue.
Well, Kathy, we're going to have part 2 tomorrow night for those of you who come back. No, I'm joking. I wish we can. I'm just feeling like, but thank you.
But that'll open, the Modernists will open in LA in January at Regan. And then it'll be in New York next November at Lehman Maupin. So it is coming to New York.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Really beautiful. Beautiful. Time for questions or not? No. We don't have time for questions.
We don't have time for questions?
No time for questions?
Yeah.
We get 2 questions. Kathy wouldn't feel right if we don't get...
No, I wouldn't. That would be really wrong in my book.
Okay. 2 questions. You better get your hands up quickly.
Maybe I've answered all your questions. Or I've completely confused you all. I have no idea.
Or they're hungry for dinner.
Yeah.
Eddie? Oh, one there in the middle.
Hi. So I'm wondering how you identify vulnerability in a subject, and as a portrait photographer, if there's an exchange of vulnerability as well.
I think that most people actually sitting before a camera and having their portrait made, it's a vulnerable... There is already inherent vulnerability within that action. When you come in and you have a formal portrait taken, I don't think there's that many people that are that comfortable in terms of revealing themselves with a camera. And so I think inherently they are vulnerable as well as strong, because I think that's the human condition in relationship to constructing portraits, at least for me.
Question number 2. There we go. Oh, here, they're going to bring a microphone for you.
No, it's you.
Within a project, you maintain a bit of control. However, when you talk about, is there an evolution when you start out with a particular idea for a project? Do you find that you evolve, and if so, in what way?
Well, the modernist evolved in really big ways after Trump got elected. So it was actually a story that I had written in 1995, and the character was going to get kidnapped by this woman named Madam and be put in a cage and have to rebuild all the modernist houses out of, wood and so forth. And then as soon as I edited it, before I started the next section of shoots that I was going to do, that I already picked a house, I realized that it had to be a lone character. That all of us feel really alone in this world right now. And I just needed that to prevail throughout it. So I am definitely influenced by, as I'm making something, how things can change within the making of things. Yeah.
Thank you, Kathy. Brava.
Thank you.